Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. We want to start this video by thanking you for your support. We are almost at 100 subscribers on the channel. We appreciate it a lot. And if you enjoy this video, feel free to like, comment, share it with your mom, your dad, your sister, your nephew, your niece, anyone you can think of. It really helps us out a lot. And if you want to participate directly in the uploads you see on this channel, feel free to go to the community tab and vote on the next team that deserves a season preview. You voted on it. Today, we are taking a look at the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And we're starting out with a 2023 recap of the Cornhuskers. What went wrong? Well, for one, the offense was just all around pretty bad. They had probably the worst quarterback room in the Power 5 last year, despite playing in the same division as Iowa. Their three quarterbacks, Jeff Sims, Heinrich Harburg, and Chuba Purdy, combined for a little bit over 1,600 yards and 10 touchdowns with 17 interceptions. Not good at all. The offense also struggled with turnovers, specifically the quarterbacks. They were 123rd in interceptions per game with 1.3, last in the country in lost fumbles per game with 1.3, last in total giveaways per game 2.6, and second to last in turnover margin, negative 1.4 every game. Absolutely abysmal. Like we said, due largely in part to quarterback play. Quarterbacks just could not hold onto the football. Very turnover prone. That's where a majority of those turnovers came from last season. The pass protection also wasn't great. This, believe it or not, was also due in large part to the incapabilities of the quarterbacks. Not able to make reads, not able to throw the ball away, kind of running directly into defenders. But the offensive line itself left a lot to be desired. They weren't awful, definitely improved as a unit, but they were 94th in sacks allowed per game, 2.4 sacks per game, and 122nd in sack allowed percentage per game. Nebraska quarterbacks were sacked over 10% of the time last season. Absolutely not what you want to see if you're Matt Rule at Nebraska. And last, the run offense also wasn't amazing. They didn't look bad. They were above average in terms of per game numbers, but Nebraska ran the ball as much as a service academy last season. They were up there in the top 10 in run percentage, but they didn't reach any of the volume that teams like Liberty, Air Force, Navy, Jacksonville State did, who had very high run play percentage numbers last season. And other than the offense, the field goal kicking was also a big issue for Nebraska in 2023. True freshman kicker Tristan Alvano struggled, which is pretty typical of true freshman kickers. He went 9 of 15 on field goals. Not bad, all things considered. 100% on extra points. There's room to grow there, absolutely, but from 40 and beyond, he just was not good. Gonna have to hit your field goals this upcoming season. We'll get more into that in a minute. And another thing that went wrong for Nebraska, big surprise, it was close losses. Close losses have plagued Nebraska for the better part of a decade at this point. And 2023 was no different. They were 1-5 in games decided by 8 or fewer points. They lost what I believe was 4 games by 3 points. That's where those field goals come into play. If you hit your field goals, you win a couple of those games. Overall, pretty typical Nebraska season last season, but that was what went wrong. What went right for Nebraska in 2023? Well, adversely to the offense going wrong in 2023, the defense went right. They were all around a great defense in 2023. They have a lot to build on going further into this upcoming season. Just listen to these stats. They were 9th in opponent yards per game, 5th in opponent yards per play, 11th in opponent points per game, 10th in opponent points per play, 7th in opponent rush yards per game, 37th in opponent pass yards per game, 17th in sacks per game, 5th in opponent pass yards per completion, and 27th in opponent red zone scoring percentage. The pass defense was definitely the weakest part of that unit, but they were still very good. The pass rush and run defense were borderline elite for Nebraska in 2023, and that's thanks to defensive coordinator Tony White. Really got the most out of his guys last season. We will talk about him more in a minute. The next thing was penalties. Now, Nebraska was noticeably undisciplined for the entirety of the Scott Frost reign of terror in the late 2010s, early 2020s. Penalties were a top concern, if not the top concern, for Nebraska going into 2023 before they found out that they didn't have a single competent quarterback on the roster, and it seemed like it would take a miracle for the team, especially the O-line, to find an ounce of discipline, which we believe they massively overachieved in for year one of a Matt Rule rebuild. Matt Rule known for tearing rosters down and building up from the ground up. Usually that means the penalties are not going to be your strongest suit, but in year one, they weren't bad. Nebraska was 28th in penalties per game, 27th in penalty yards per game, 41st in penalty-induced first downs, 38th in penalties per play, and 44th in penalty yards per penalty. Now, these numbers might not sound that great when you first look at them, but keep in mind Nebraska hovered around the 70 to 100 range the previous 5 years, and were in the top 50 in all those in Rule's first season at Nebraska. Very impressive all around. Of course, turnovers were a huge issue, especially for the quarterbacks, but outside of the quarterback position, the team seemed pretty disciplined, and that's a testament to how good Rule truly is. And that is what happened in 2023. What about 2024? Nebraska's schedule is very interesting to say the least. They start off on a 4-game home game stretch, starting off at UTEP, and then to Colorado, and then Northern Iowa, Illinois, at Purdue, at home versus Rutgers, then a bye week, on the road versus Indiana, on the road versus Ohio State, at home versus UCLA, and then another bye week, on the road in Southern California to take on USC, at home versus Wisconsin, and then on the road versus Iowa. Now, having those first 4 games at home for Nebraska is crucial. It's going to give them an advantage. They started off on the road for their first 2 games, I believe, last season against Minnesota and Colorado, and they lost both of those games. Didn't play to their favor very well. But this year, the first 7 games on the schedule, honestly, are all very winnable games, but they may have to win 6 of those first 7 if they want to go bowling. The final 5 is pretty gnarly, especially for a Big Ten schedule. It's a mixture of tough home games in Wisconsin and UCLA, and then some gruesome away games in Ohio State, USC, and Iowa. Absolutely not what you want to see. Nebraska has the capability to pull off a few of those games, but going to be tough nonetheless. And that was their schedule. What about some strengths for Nebraska this season? Well, for one, the defense should be very, very good once again. If you did not see our top 10 defense list, go ahead and watch that after this video. Nebraska was on that list. They're going to return an already great defense with one of the highest returning production percentages in the sport, and they return defensive coordinator Tony White, who was speculated to leave for a head coaching job this offseason. He did not. He gets a raise. He stays. Absolutely crucial for this defense. Going to be one of the better defenses in the Big Ten once again this season. And for their second strength, it's going to be the running back room. While the run game seemed above average to mediocre at times last year, that was mainly due to the fact that teams knew Nebraska was going to run most of the time. They couldn't really pass at all. Like we said, the quarterbacks sucked. And they're going into 2024 with a very deep unit. They return a key contributor from last season in Emmett Johnson, and they get back 2 injured running backs, Ramir Johnson and Gabe Ervin, all while adding a highly coveted 4-star transfer running back in Oregon's Dante Dowdell. He's highly rated as a prospect, highly rated as a transfer, and he lands at Nebraska where he should get a lot of touches, massively talented, still very young. Going to be interesting to see how that running back room shakes out. All of those guys we listed have RB1 potential. We'll have to wait and see who actually gets that. And for their last strength, it's going to be the offensive line. Similarly to the running back room, the O-line was put in a tough position due to the quarterback play last year, but they return all 5 starters from last year, and they add Florida transfer Micah Mazuka to add depth to what should be a fairly deep unit, and they're going to benefit from the addition of a little-known quarterback recruit named Dylan Raiola. Don't know if you've ever heard of him. That is, of course, sarcasm. One of the biggest stories of the offseason last year. And those were the strengths. What about some weaknesses for Nebraska? Now, before we get into this segment, disclaimer, just because we have something listed as a weakness doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be bad in that area. It's just probably going to be one of the weaker points on the team. Starting off, we have the wide receiver room. Nebraska did a good job at going out of their way to add 2 experienced wide receivers to help strengthen that room that was very, very young and inexperienced last season. They add guys like Isaiah Nayer and Jamal Banks, who have plenty of Power 5 experience, and other than them, they have some decent dudes coming in from last season, but the unit overall probably still won't be great or even good next year. But Nebraska doesn't really need to have a great wide receiver room to be effective. Really, they just have to have an average season for the room for Nebraska to have a difference from 5 to maybe 8 or 9 wins even. They have talent there, just all around not very deep, very young. And while the transfers they added are experienced, they're not world beaters in terms of pure talent. And next for the weaknesses, it's going to be field goal kicking. Like we talked about before, Alvano struggled with his composure last year, couldn't really hit anything from beyond 40, and he could improve next season with another offseason of work, but he will have to take a massive step forward for the field goal kicking to not be considered a weakness this season. And for the third weakness, it's going to be quarterback inexperience. Now hold your horses, folks. Dylan Raiola is an amazing prospect. Do not get me wrong, but he is just a prospect at the end of the day. We really have no idea how he's going to do this season just yet. And we've talked about inexperienced guys like Nico Iamalieva and Jackson Arnold. And those guys get the benefit of 1 or 2 years in their programs before taking starting reps. But Raiola, not so much. He's coming in directly out of high school. He's going to be the starter day 1 most likely, and that could be good or bad, but that's usually not ideal. But like the wide receiver room, Raiola doesn't need to come out and throw for 4,000 yards and 35 touchdowns in his first season for Nebraska to succeed. As long as he isn't literally the worst quarterback in the Western Hemisphere, he will probably still be better than anything they had last year. And that was the 2024 overview. Let's get into some predictions. But first, as always, let's talk about some keys to success for Nebraska in this upcoming season. The first key to success is going to be keeping it simple. You won't do yourself any favors by pretending you're a great team because you got a 5-star quarterback. You just have to stick with what works, which in 2023 was the power run, the option, simple reads, a few deep shots a game, and then playing very good defense. And you have somebody that can run an offense now. Raiola should be very talented, but for the team's sake, for Raiola's sake, for everybody's sake, you don't need to overcomplicate things just because you add a decent amount of talent this year. And for their next keys to success, it's going to be leaning on that defense. The defense bailed Nebraska's offense out countless times last season, but the offense couldn't capitalize. If it wasn't a fumble or an interception, it was missing targets deep, missing targets over the middle, overthrowing guys, or just making bad reads in general. But with the returning production this season, it would be a giant surprise if Nebraska is even a little bit worse than they were last year on defense. And with a defense like that, you retain the ability to make mistakes. You're probably going to make plenty of them with a freshman quarterback. Just don't make as many as you did last year, and you should be fine. And for their final key to success, it's going to be hitting your field goals. This is massive, especially for a team like Nebraska, and it's going to be a pretty big ask this year. Nebraska lost by 3 or less 4 times in 2023, and if Alvano hit 12 field goals instead of 9, Nebraska could have won 8 games instead of the 5 that they hit last season. Likewise, going from a 60% field goal kicker to a 75% field goal kicker this season could be the difference between a game or two. Going to be big for Nebraska. Big Ten games usually aren't barn burners. It's not going to be like Alabama, Georgia. It's not going to be like Washington, Oregon last year. Those games are going to hit the under and usually going to be decided by less than 1 score. So for Nebraska, just hit your field goals. And those were the keys to success. Let's get right into the final grades for Nebraska this season. The offense is going to come out to an 82.5. Now this feels really high for us considering how bad they were last year. We don't really feel comfortable rating them any higher. They do make a lot of solid additions and they return a lot of production from last year, but considering just how bad they were last year, it would be irresponsible to rate them any higher. Gonna be an average offense this year. And if you're a Nebraska fan, that's all you can hope for, considering you were miserable last season. And for the defense, they're going to come out to a 94.0. Great unit. What more can you really say? Tony White is amazing as a coordinator, and they have room to improve in the secondary, but they're all around fundamentally solid with great depth again in 2024. And for special teams, they're going to round out to a 78.5. They left a lot to be desired last year. Punter Brian Buschini, who we haven't talked about in this video, was decent, but he was inconsistent, made a few bad punts that gave opponents great field position. Gonna have to improve a little bit, but especially Tristan Alvano has to improve this year. We've talked about that enough in this video. And as for coaching, Nebraska's going to come out to an 86.0. Might feel a little bit low, but we promise no disrespect intended. Matt Rule picked honestly his perfect match in Nebraska, like every stop previously in Temple and Baylor. Nebraska was in desperate need of a rebuild, and his year one in Lincoln showed his method works, believe it or not. The MO for Matt Rule teams is build upon the defense and be disciplined, and Nebraska was about 75% of the way there last year, but the 25% was in the most crucial areas. This season they'll probably be closer to 90% of the way there. And on top of that, Tony White will also be poised, like we said, for another great season, probably his last in Lincoln. He should absolutely be a head coach next season in 2025. As for strength of schedule, Nebraska is going to come out to a 92.0. Pretty difficult all around, not awful though. They'll get an opportunity to learn and grow over the first 4 games instead of jumping immediately into the fire like they did last season. And overall, that'll bring Nebraska to an 86.6. Pretty solid rating. They should be a good team this year, and everything kind of depends on how good Dylan Raiola is. No pressure, but if Dylan Raiola comes out and he's a top 3, top 5 Big Ten quarterback this year, Nebraska could be a playoff team. But if he comes out and he's very poor, you might finish below 500. Once again, just depends on how good he can truly be in his first year in college and as a starter. And with that, we have our final predictions. The ceiling for Nebraska is going to be 10-2 with a 7-2 conference record. This feels ridiculously high, but in this scenario, Nebraska would beat all the teams they should, including 2 games against either Iowa, Wisconsin, Rutgers, or Colorado, who will all be formidable opponents. And this would also mean everything goes right. You hold the mistakes and the turnovers to a minimum, and Dylan Raiola performs out of his mind, which isn't too far out of the realm of possibilities, but pretty unlikely. And their floor is going to be 5-7 with a 3-6 conference record. Absolutely not what you want to see if you're a Cornhusker fan. But just as the others seemed pretty unlikely, this also seems fairly unlikely, but you can never really tell with Nebraska. In this scenario, this would require Nebraska to lose all of their toughest games and then add an extra loss to an Illinois, Purdue, Indiana, or UCLA. Likewise, not out of the realm of possibilities for Nebraska this season. And that brings us to our final prediction. It's going to be 7-5 with a 5-4 conference record. And this just feels right to us. You can argue that 8-4 or 9-3 could very well be in the cards for Nebraska, but we are counting on Nebraska to lose 1 or 2 games that they probably shouldn't. Maybe those close 1-score losses creep up again this year, which has been prone to happen for what feels like 2 decades at this point. But believe it or not, we feel like Nebraska is on the right track. Year 2 should see a lot of improvement, including in record, and Nebraska fans should absolutely be happy with a lot of moral victories, going 7-5, and finally that elusive bowl appearance that they've wanted for so long this upcoming season. And that's going to wrap up the Nebraska 2024 season preview. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Share with everyone you've ever met in your life. Just kidding, you don't have to do that. And if you agree or disagree, feel free to drop a comment. We want to hear what you have to say. And if you want to choose the next team to get a season preview on this channel, go to the community tab and vote on the next team. As always, thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.